Hello, everyone. I'm Jacob Haller, and my pronouns are he and him. I'm the co host of the Love You Like Crazy podcast, which is about young adult fiction and has been going on since 2015. I've been collecting resources to share with people who are thinking about starting their own podcast, and I recently decided to try to talk to some independent podcasters I admire about their experiences and what they've learned. I used to teach an intro to podcasting class in Rhode Island, and I originally met the folks I'm talking to today when they took the class in 2017. Since then, they've gone on to create the How It Ends podcast, a scripted audio drama in which a woman starts a podcast as a way for her and her friends to explore and investigate a disturbing recurring dream that she's been having. It's an engaging and creepy podcast, also has a sense of humor. And I'm really excited to have the podcast two showrunners, Micah Rodriguez and Stephanie Resendes, here to talk to me about it. Thanks for agreeing to do this.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having us.
Did I miss anything or get anything wrong?
No, that was a pretty great
little
snippet
great
about our show.
Of what we're doing. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I'll join
and she, her as well.
So to start with, I wanted to talk about your background in podcasting. What sort of got you interested in starting your own podcast?
Stephanie, you want to?
Yeah. So I never really listened to audio dramas. Mike actually got me into them, and we would, listen to them. We wouldn't be together, but we would listen to them and kind of do like a 3-2-1 play and like listen and then text each other while we were listening to them. And we just kind of wanted to put our own spin on like a more character-driven mystery. A lot of these audio dramas that we were listening to had these really great stories, but we just wanted to know more about the characters and like their backgrounds and who they were. They were kind of just props in the story. So we decided to kind of write it backwards. Not write it backwards. That's the wrong way of saying it, because I think a lot of writers develop their characters first. But like what was most important to us was developing our characters. So that's where we started, like who they are as people, their birthdays, we have like dossiers that are, 10 pages long, and their first car that they ever owned, or like their most embarrassing moment in high school. So like we know everything about them. And I think that's what comes through in the dialogue. People tell us a lot, like it sounds like I'm sitting in a room with 3 friends and they're just talking and I'm just like eavesdropping on them. And that's like the biggest compliment that somebody can pay us, because that's exactly, what we were going for.
Yeah, I think that as far as like getting interested in podcasting, it was just by being in like proximity to the medium, right? And like listening to really good storytelling and in different types. Like I listened to some D&D podcasts, and I listened to some audio dramas that Stephanie and I would listen to together, like she said. And again, I kind of want to echo that like there's so much good storytelling out there, but we wanted to try our hand at really kind of like doubling down on characters that we feel like you, me, and everyone we know could know, and actually probably do know, and that feel like they translate out of audio very much like characters translate out of like TV or, sort of film media, that sort of thing. A little side note as to one of the reasons why we actually ended up really diving into it is that the year that we started listening to these shows together, I was kind of going through something medically that was really scary, and it was really stressful. And, Stephanie and I had this shared interest in storytelling and writing, and we got excited about creating this story in a medium that neither one of us had ever touched before. So really, it sort of emerged as a really necessary and vital creative outlet during a really, really rocky, kind of terrible time for me. And it was just such a lifesaver to be able to direct some of that stress and that energy into building out a world of characters and people that I feel like, like Stephanie said, we know them. We know their birthdays, we know their astrological signs, we know what music they listen to and what kind of cars that they drive or will never drive, or like, what kind of weird convictions and hangups that they have. And it was like, creating a sort of a world that transcended the one that, like, me personally, that I was kind of going through. So I think that was like a weird kind of happy accident, you know what I mean? Like happy accident of how that kind of came to be. But yeah.
So, were there particular goals that you had in mind when you got started, and did they change as you were going?
Yeah. So kind of going back to the idea that of characters being really very present inside the medium and out. Stephanie kind of touched upon it a little bit. We started, before we started drawing up a story, we drafted these dossiers and built out entire lives for our characters. And that, like, some of these really sort of specific things that helped this character become the person that they were ended up in the show. Spoiler alert, sorry for anybody who's watching or listening, but in season 2, Devin, our beloved Devin, tells a story about how he became a printmaker as a personal artist, and like as a maker himself, even though that's not his job. And he tells a story about how he got interested in art, and that was actually something that Stephanie and I had kind of thought about and made built into the character 2 years before it ever became part of the script. So that's something we knew that made Devin who he was as a person. So that's one of the major goals. I also think that it was also, I guess, to kind of put a finer point on it, I think making sure that our characters and our storytelling was as authentic as possible as well. So I think, for instance, we have a therapist and a session with Micah's character going to visit her therapist, Billy. And as we were writing that script, we actually consulted with someone who's a degreed mental health counselor, and making sure that, like, that scene was as authentic as possible, and that the therapist was giving good advice and also asking questions that a therapist would ask, and not just like our interpretation of what therapists would probably say for somebody who's struggling from probably post-traumatic stress from the loss of a parent and, debilitating nightmares, right? Like, we could wax philosophical all we want about how our therapist, I go to therapy, it's great. But how our therapist might react, or like might say what they might say to us, but like, I don't know what a trained professional would say. So it was really important to do that. And kind of going into that, we also wanted, one of our major goals was that our dialogue felt incredibly real and super immersive, and that, like Stephanie said, people often tell us that they feel like when they're listening to our show, they're kind of eavesdropping in on a friendship that is just existing next to them. And yet they're really interested in what those friends are talking about. Like, again, that's the best compliment we could ever get, because that's exactly what we set out to do. We set out to create that experience where you're like, we wanted you to care. I think that's maybe a succinct way to say it, right, Stephanie? Is that we wanted you to care about the story, and we wanted you to care about what happened to our characters, but also we wanted you to care about why. Like, we wanted you to know the why. We wanted you to know why you should care about Micah and care about Elia when Elia's feelings are hurt, or when Devin's feelings are hurt by the central character, because that central character is kind of causing a ripple effect in her search to figure things out. And that's because that's what happens with real people when they're experiencing and working through trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know. So I think that that's kind of the major goals. Stephanie, do you have anything that you want to add? Did I miss anything?
I mean, just that's, so if you listen from the beginning, we didn't like say, hey, this is us, we're Stephanie and Micah, and we're creating this audio drama podcast. We just kind of quietly released it. We actually put like the character Micah's name as like the creator, so like she was showing up in Apple Podcasts and all that. And we didn't want people to say who's doing this or like who's making this. It wasn't like, we kind of wanted to trick people into thinking maybe it could be real, like give them that kind of sense of like, is this a real person? And like, we did that because we had to like kind of pull back the curtain because people would, we have Instagram accounts for our main characters, and people would message her and be like, "Are you okay?" Like, so,
Yeah,
but like that was just
that
another,
definitely happened.
yeah, and that was just another layer of like, getting people to really first and foremost care about these characters. And if you've seen, like, again, listen to the first episode, it's pretty emotionally heavy, and so it's either like from the get-go you're either all the way in or you're like not interested. Like there's no in between.
And that's okay. Like maybe the show is just
Yeah.
not for you, right? Yeah. One of the things that, Stephanie just brought up the first episode. One of the things that happened when that episode released, we had I had a friend of mine reach out to me who had recently lost a parent, or like within the last few years lost a parent. And they said, you nailed it. Like, that's what it feels like. That's what it feels like every day to be somebody who has lost their father, and to go through the world and navigate through the world with the loss of a parent. And thank you. I feel my feelings are validated by this episode. And like, that makes me very emotional, and in a good way, because it means that what we were trying to do, like really it hit the mark. And it may not hit the mark for every single person. And we obviously are doing our best to not harm anybody by the content that we create, but like the fact that it did connect to someone who had experienced something similar to Micah, was really humbling, I think, to get that kind of feedback, and to constantly get that kind of feedback for this story.
So when you decided to start the podcast, how did you kind of start assembling, actors and a crew and whatnot?
So I think when we first started, we developed the 3 main characters, and then we're like, oh, well, Micah's mom should be in it. And then like the story just kept growing, and then so did like our cast of characters. And then we're like,
Yeah,
we have no money to fund this. Like, we're not backed by anyone.
Yeah.
Like, we can't afford an actor like an hourly rate or whatever. And I think it just slowly, Micah was like, well, I could ask my friend this, and I could ask my friend this if they would like be willing to. And so we just kind of started asking our friends, and they're not actors or performers or voiceover artists. They're just like our regular people. And it was like, well, this friend, they kind of have the same personality as this character. Like, maybe they could do it. And like, honestly, we just got super lucky because we have all of these friends with 0 experience who have turned out to be like these incredible voice actors.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
We like, it's a tricky thing to talk about because like, obviously you always want to pay people for their time. You want to value people's time. Like, nobody should have to work for free. But, we were just very upfront with them, and we said, this is what we're doing. We don't have any money to pay you. If it ever becomes something where like we're going to make money, like we're going to share it with everyone. Like, we're not trying to use anyone or take advantage of anyone. But, we just said to them, if we make money, you'll make money. And if it's not, it's just a fun project that we can all work on together. And, nobody turned us down.
Yeah. That was kind of a very, like, we were very, very lucky. I also think part of that is the fact that, Stephanie and I do, we do the directing, we do the producing, and we do the writing for all of the scripts. However, all of our cast has a lot of input on their characters. Like, we built out this world and these characters, but we are not the authority on the lived experience of every single person that exists in our show. So if there was someone who had a lived experience that was fundamentally different than the one that I have and that Stephanie has, we made sure to like check in with them and say, like, how do you feel this character, you playing this character, like would react in this situation? And we really took a lot of that feedback. We did a lot of listening, I think. In terms of like when we were developing the characters and when we were also writing the script. So while we were just like, please help us, friends, because you're awesome and you're doing this in kind and on good faith that like if we ever make money, we'll compensate you. But it was really important to both of us, I think, if that's fair to say, Stephanie, it was important to both of us that they didn't just feel like pieces in our story, that they were also really contributors to the overall like greater project. And, you know, I don't think, as an example, I don't think that the friendship between Micah, Elia, and Devin could be even remotely what it is without the incredible, like, amazing input of our friend Deloisier, who plays Devin.
Mm-hmm.
And he, like, I mean, we haven't seen each other in a really long time because of the pandemic, and, like, we spent 2 years, like, almost every weekend in the studio, like, working together, and, like, I desperately miss working with him because he brings so much to the show. Also, happy birthday! It's whatever.
Yeah, it's his birthday today.
Today is Loisier's birthday. Happy birthday! But yeah, like, I think that, I mean, all of our characters had a lot of say, and a lot of, like, you know, we would give scripts ahead of time, and they would get to make notes and say, like, you know, I don't feel like I feel comfortable saying it this way. Can I rephrase it? And we'd be like, yeah, absolutely. Do what feels natural, because that's only going to translate in the audio. That's going to translate in the interaction between these two characters. And I think that that's what you're hearing when you're listening to our show.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think even, you know, sometimes there was people who are a little more leery of saying, like, I'm not comfortable with this. But you can always hear it. Like, when you're recording and, like, a line is just not sounding right, or, like, something just isn't syncing up, we would just say, like, how would you say that? How would you say that line? If somebody said this to you, what would be your response? And you just always get a better performance out of people when you do that.
Especially, yeah, exactly. If you ask them to sort of just, like, put their spin on it. And I think that that's what actors do, right? That's what makes good actors. But while we were just working with people who we thought were just our friends, it turns out that they are amazing actors at the same time. So, like, and I think that a lot of that emerged because we were asking them to do that. Like, we were asking them to, like, to check us, honestly. Like, the script isn't static. Like, it's dynamic. And I think that that's kind of like the basis of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and we were just asking them to basically be themselves instead of, like, putting on a performance of a character we wrote.
Yep.
So, the podcast, you know, in the world of the podcast, a lot of the discussions and things happen in different places. Like, one of the episodes in season 1 takes place mostly in a bar, and then there are other ones, you know, that there are phone conversations. There are all these things, you know, that have different sounds, different ambiances, and so on. So how do you approach capturing the sounds of these different places?
You want to take that, Stephanie?
Yeah. So it's really, like, we didn't know what we were doing when we first started. Nope. So we just kind of, like, tried everything. And, you know, I think, like, for a lot of the beginning, the first few episodes, we were, you know, if it sounded like we were sitting at a table in a restaurant in Salem, we were actually sitting down at a table and walking across a wood floor. Like, we were actually physically acting things out in order to get the sound effects. And, you know, like, through trial and error, we eventually started, you know, we found it's like freesoundeffects.com, I think. You get like 100 sounds for $100. And we have used, like, not even half of them. So we download, like, some very specific, you know, if we need, like, the sound of a bow and arrow, like, obviously we're going to download it from there. But, like, if we need something.
Although I do have one right behind me.
You do. We just can't.
I do have one right behind me.
We just can't shoot it in the middle of Providence.
We cannot. So.
But yeah, we kind of just evaluate every scene and say, you know, what works for this? Can it be done in the studio and then overlaid with sound effects? Do we have to act it out? Is it a hybrid? You know, there's, I don't want to spoil anything, but there's the last episode of season 2, I believe. Ellie is kind of frantically going around her kitchen trying to put together a meal really quick. And we couldn't find any sound effects that sounded like that. So I flipped on a recorder and I just started throwing stuff around my kitchen and taking knives out of the drawer and slamming pans down on the thing. And and I sent it to our audio engineer and he spliced it together. So it's really, we do a little bit of everything.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's another thing to mention too, because you mentioned Chris. The person who does a lot of who sort of assists us with sound design and then does all of our editing is Chris Anderson, who's a godsend because he is very talented and made it so we didn't have to learn how to edit at the same time as learning how to create this kind of whole world. But I think working really closely with him and when he's editing and when we're sort of layering the sound effects in to really being super picky, poor Chris, I'm so sorry, super picky about like how things fade in and out and how things layer on each other and saying like, nope, that sounds tinny, like that sounds, it sounds fake. And if anything sounded particularly fake, we redid it, and then we redid it, and then we redid it again because we just wanted it to feel super real. I think maybe this is a great juncture to talk about one of the funniest ways that one of the funniest like moments I think that we were creating sound effects in season 1. Jacob, you might remember. Mike is at home. It's pretty late at night, and Mike is at home. This is bad that I kind of don't remember because it's a while. She was going through a journal, right? She's going through her dad's journal, and all of a sudden the windows start to shake, and there's like lots of banging on her windows, and then her alarm triggers. There's slamming doors and like doorknobs jiggling. That was all real. Like we actually all did. We did that in the middle of the day at my house. We had like three people outside my house. Banging on my downstairs windows while Aloysier and I were acting out that scene. And I want to tell you that it's actually really unnerving to do that. It's actually really disorienting, super scary to have that happen, even though I was very acutely aware that it was fake. But it was super traumatizing in a way.
It also really scared the FedEx guy that was delivering a package across the street.
It did. Yeah, we had to be like, sorry, we're recording something. This is not a weird break-in at 2 p.m. on a Saturday in the full daylight, like because and we kind of jokingly refer to a friend of ours as window slapper number 3, because we had a couple people like outside banging on the windows, and that's just kind of how we've done things. Like if somebody's racing around the house, that also happens in season 2 where Mike is kind of frantically looking for her mom. We ran around the house and we recorded those like kind of frantic footsteps and doors opening and closing and that kind of thing. And how like you would sound breathing when you were doing that, right? Like, cause you wouldn't be like super calm sitting down and while you were running around a house, you wouldn't be able to do that. You would sound weird. You would sound, unless you have like the best lungs on the planet, I guess. Yeah. I don't know. I don't. But you get winded if you're frantic and you're running around and you're scared. Yeah. So I think it was kind of that. We have a lot of really funny moments of sound design specifically.
Yeah. And I think even like we try to, even when we're in the studio, we try and do that. Like if Micah and Devin are hanging out in their apartment and Elia comes over, I'll go outside the studio and walk in and like talk as I'm walking towards the microphone just to get that same like authenticity.
That fade in, the quality.
So you've referred to the studio a few times. Is that at AS220 or a different one?
It is. We record basically everything unless we have created some sort of mini set for a particular scene at AS220 Industries in the podcast room, like the podcast recording room. I'm a former employee of AS220. I think if anybody who's watching this is not from Providence and is not familiar with AS220, it's an unjuried, uncensored arts organization that has done amazing things for artists in the state of Rhode Island for the last 30 years. And when we were figuring out how we were going to be able to afford to create this show, and trying to minimize immediate costs for the two of us, ASU20 was an amazing resource to be able to do that because they have this podcast room. So we were able to become Industries members and rent time, when we do our recording sessions, and most of that stuff happens there. Mm-hmm. So it's not particularly our studio where we do all of the mic recordings and stuff like that. But yeah, ASU20 is a lifesaver. It's great.
Yeah. And I would just say to people out there who aren't in Rhode Island, it's worth looking around. If you don't have a space you can record at home, check around and see if there are any studios that are available for reasonable, because like I feel like many cities have sort of maker spaces, and they might have a room that either they have designated for this or that they're willing to make available to you.
Yeah, or even there's a writers club downtown. I know has a podcasting studio, and there's, I think it's up in Cambridge or Boston, the podcasting garage or
podcast
something.
Garage.
Yeah,
I think that's another one that does that. It's a community space.
Yeah, so I think a lot more are popping up here and there. Probably not right now, but they were.
Yeah.
And they will be.
And they will be again.
They will be at some point. Yeah.
So when you're recording at home, like, what are you using? Just using your phone, or do you have equipment you're using?
It really depends on what we're doing. Some things that were, I guess, more complex, kind of like the window slapping number 3 scene. Chris Anderson, our editor, helped us sort of design that sound, and he has like lapel mics that we would to be able to use to record the dialogue that's happening, and then sometimes we would just rely on sort of the around sound, like the what's the word I want to use, like the atmosphere
Ambient.
that's actually happening in the scene. What's that?
Ambient sound?
Yeah, the ambient sound, and like the sort of like the atmosphere that we're creating in the scene. But I mean, I have a Blue Yeti, and a lot of like the more like sort of granular stuff is the iPhone. Like paper is shuffling and that sort of thing that we create, the sounds that we created, where we're all just recorded on the voice memos app.
Yeah, and even there are scenes where Micah is just making herself a note on her voice memo app. So we just, you use that, and then it sounds like it comes from that,
Yeah, same thing with phone calls. If somebody called and left a voicemail, we had somebody call and leave a voicemail, because it gives you that grainy phone sound.
The both of us are in a couple of podcasting groups on Facebook, and it's just funny because people will be like, how do you get like audio to sound like a voicemail? And people will be suggesting all these filters and this and that, and we're like, we just leave a voicemail. Like, that's,
but you can save it as a file. It does it for you. Yeah.
So how did you deal with getting like icons and other art for the podcast?
So I guess we to start in the first part of it, our branding and How It Ends Studio as and the podcast as a brand was sort of conceptualized by me and Stephanie together, and then her partner Povilas does a lot of our graphic design. We also had some graphic design by another friend of mine named Brian Kenny, who did some of the stuff that helped us make some of the merch come together. But the sort of actual art design really comes from the two of us. I think we're just like, we have this vision of what we want it to look like, and then we're like, hey, can you make this happen? Because that'd be great. As far as we do have the part of the other like sort of immersive quality, Stephanie mentioned that our characters have Instagrams. Micah has an Instagram, and there has been artwork that in story has been created by her father. So there's a lot of sketches, and there's drawings, and there's a journal that has a lot of writing and that sort of thing in it. And we worked with a close friend of ours named Emily Boucher, who's this incredible Rhode Island artist who is essentially Nolan as the artist. Like Emily has or essentially donated to us like a lot of her old sketches and figure drawings. But the piece de resistance really is that she created an faux aged Nolan's journal. Which we have as a physical prop, and it has these gorgeous sketches of, the fox imagery of Micah being a kit and that sort of thing, and leaf sketches, and really like we just had a really great meeting with her and said that this is kind of how we envision Nolan as a person who journals and what he would put in it, and she took it and she ran with it, and I think. I might have cried when she handed us the journal, because if we're ever able to like show it to anybody, it's such an amazing artifact that she created for the show. And because the show is audio, like to have a physical thing that you can like actually touch and say like this is an embodiment of the story and an embodiment of a really important character was like really awesome. So that's really the art. And then the music, is created by another friend of a musician friend of mine from my home state in New Jersey. And he and I made music together all through while I was in high school and a little bit until I was maybe 22 and I moved away. But he's super talented. His name is Joshua Van Ness, and Stephanie and I had a meeting with him, and we sort of pitched what we wanted for a theme, or kind of how the vibe was for the show, and how we were trying to like how we wanted to score the first and second seasons. And Joshua also just ran with it. And what you hear are all original creations made by him. And like our goal is to release a soundtrack. We actually are compiling some of the songs that he put together and release a soundtrack of season 1 of like the theme and a lot of the music that he created for the first season, and eventually season 2 and then upcoming seasons. So again, I think that maybe we just need to say that we're super lucky to be surrounded by this like magnanimous talent by pretty much everybody we know.
Yeah.
So it just worked out that way. Everybody we know is just this fantastic creator, whether they even knew it or not. You know, a lot of them were not necessarily identifying as creatives, and now I think it would be unfair to say that they are not.
So when this is more of like a technical question than anything, I suppose, but like, do you record a season at a time and then release things that are already recorded, or do you record as you go, or how does that work?
I think so. It was very record as you go in season 1 because, again, we had no idea what we were doing. And, you know, like we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know like how much time it would take Chris to do something because like we just had no clue. So we were really like, he would send us a file at like 9:00 at night and we would post it for 8:00 the next morning sometimes. And like also again, like how I said, you know, we released it in the beginning without our names on it, trying to like kind of create that, you know, sense of, is this real or is this not? And so we didn't have a regular posting schedule to kind of match up with that feeling. It was mostly, you know, something had to happen on Thanksgiving and something had to happen right before Christmas. And so it wasn't like most podcasts where it's, you know, every 2 weeks on a Wednesday. And so then once like, you know, the cat was kind of out of the bag and people knew it was audio drama and we had put our names on it and everything, we started releasing more regularly, and it just gave us better like schedules for recording and planning. And, you know, sometimes there's, you know, a little thing that needs to be tweaked and we're bothering Chris about it like 700 times because it doesn't sound exactly the way we want it to. And so we'll still, you know, sometimes
and he's very gracious and kind.
Yeah, he is. And we'll still, you know, so once in a while for season 2, we had to, you know, schedule something the night before it was supposed to be released, but we're definitely getting better at planning ahead and trying to stack recordings. We would also, you know, we were all, again, brand new actors and performers. And so sometimes it would take us, you know, a whole Saturday to record one episode. And I think we did like 5 in one Saturday, like for season 2. So we're also getting really good at like getting faster at recording so that Chris just has a bunch of files to work with and he can, you know, bang them out.
Yeah. And I think that also probably another thing that lent to the speed increase was that I think we were also a lot more comfortable with the characters, right? Like it felt like settling into like a friend, even though, you know, these characters were similar to us, but they're very different in a lot of ways. But when you're kind of leaning into something you're super familiar with, it was like less bumpy. The first take was a lot less bumpy. And there was actually a lot of times in the second season where the cast, you know, Stephanie and I and the rest of the cast, we would just nail it in the first take. And we were kind of like, that sounded really good, right? Like, should we do it again? Like, should we do it again just for posterity, just to make sure? I want to mention too, that we also have, we don't do things in a vacuum. We have a creative consultant that works with us. Leslie Kinzel. I mean, I always mess up her last name too. So you're not alone, Stephanie. Sorry, Leslie. But she attends a lot of our recordings too, and she has experience writing for TV, and she's just a very, very storied writer. She has a lot of amazing resume, and she was super vital in being a part of kind of just being that third party, right? To be in the recording room when Stephanie and I are trying to like act and direct and listen for those weird audio hiccups. That Leslie could listen and go, hey, like, I think if you tweak the way you perform this one way, you're going to get more of what you're trying to get out of it, right? And it was super helpful to have that person in the room as well. And that kind of lends itself to the sort of technical thing. But having that sped the whole process up.
Yeah.
Like Stephanie said, like season 2 was a lot much more of an well-oiled machine than season 1, which was just kind of like by the seat of your pants, like, whoa, let's see how this goes. You know? Yeah. Yay. We nailed it. Maybe.
How far ahead do you plan this story? Like, do you...
We have like a very general art, like we know how it's going to end.
Yes.
Like whether it takes us 1 more season to get there or 2 more or 4 more, like we don't know, but like we know the general arc of the entire story and like where Micah's journey is going to take her. But it's really, we'll, sit down and say, okay, it's time for season 3 planning. What happens? Generally, we work backwards, actually. What happens in the last episode? How do we want this season to end? What do we want the cliffhanger to be? And then we work backwards and we write backwards from there. So that's why it's like, it could take 10 episodes. It could take, 12 or 13. And, sometimes we'll write, actually, you can see right behind Micah. That's our storyboard.
I was waiting.
I was gonna
finish your thought and then I'm going to show it.
Yeah.
It's very aggressive.
So, yeah. And like for this season, we like storyboarded each episode on its own. And I think we had 12. And then we started writing 1 episode and we're like, there's just not enough here, like, to fill it. Like, what do we do? And so we would just mash some stuff together from these 2 and then move a little bit of that episode over there. And I think we got it down to 10. And then we were writing another.
No, it's 11. It's 11.
Well, I think at one point we got it down to 10 and then we started writing another episode and we're like, this is way too long. So then we broke that one apart. So like it went from like 12 to 10 to 11. So, it's just, it's planning, but then it's also knowing when to say like, it's time to go to plan B because this isn't working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really I would say it's a super organic process. And it's definitely like it's really collaborative. It's like one of my favorite parts of making the show is that Stephanie and I usually, when there's not a pandemic, we're usually in this room that I'm in right now, just coming up, it really starts with like, what's exciting to us? You know what I mean? Like what's exciting to us? What would be fun to do and act? Like what would be fun to write? And what scares can I swear on YouTube? I have no idea.
Yeah, I think so.
Sure. Like what scares the shit out of us? Like honestly, like what would really scare me? And not in like the sort of standard jump scary kind of way, but in that creepy, dread building sort of suspicious kind of feeling that makes you unsettled. But so I don't know if anybody can see it. It's backwards, but this is the entire story map for season 2. All of our clues and are really kind of like, where the magic really is all in red, so you can't read it, which is awesome. But yeah, like this, and we did this for season 1 as well. And it helps us sort of map out every episode and like who's in every episode and how they interact with each other, where we're going to drop hints, how those hints connect to each other. What is it that from the McElroy Brothers TV show that where Justin McElroy calls up Lin-Manuel and he said,
if you set up a dong in Act 1, you got to pay it off in Act 3.
Right? So
we're making sure we're paying it off.
We're making sure that when we set something up that the loop gets closed or that it gets closed in a way that it can be still open for like another show, for another season or in another episode. So we're not finding ourselves in these giant gaping plot holes accidentally. So like, but Stephanie's right. It is like a lot of planning, but it's also saying like, we have to be able to pivot at the same time. Like we can't just write ourselves into and attach ourselves to a story and say, this is how it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And that's it, because what if that doesn't work? you know, when we're actually kind of like laying it out. And so it's flexible.
Yeah, it's kind of that idea too of like kill your darlings. Like there are scenes that we've written that like stand alone by themselves are like incredible scenes, but it just didn't work in the story. It didn't make sense, and like you have to know when to cut it.
Yeah, and you have to be like the kill your darlings thing is very near and dear. Like you have to be willing to let it go. Like fun fact, like the first season was actually originally supposed to start. The first episode was supposed to be on Halloween, and it was actually we were going to air when Micah, Devin, and Elia actually decided to start the podcast, and like how the whole conversation happened to make them do that. And we have the recording of, we have rehearsals of that episode, and it didn't feel like it really, it didn't land right in the way that we kind of wanted it to like lead on our show. And we decided to make the decision to air the episode that you heard, the first episode, which is so sad.
Yeah. And that was originally supposed to be episode 2, and it just became episode 1. And now we have that recording, and maybe we'll release it as like some kind of bonus one day, because it's hilarious. And there's so many good moments, like that friendship between Devin, Elia, and Micah. I think we actually recorded that at your house, and we actually like ordered a pizza and bought Halloween candy. And like, so there's like sounds of Halloween candy being ripped open and Elia eating way too much of it. And like we had wrappers everywhere, and there, like the scene itself, it's all like one long scene. The episode is incredible, but it wasn't working. We had to cut it.
Yeah, and it does exist in some audio file, in some file. Like we do have it. But yeah, and there was definitely like episodes that had parts of conversations. I feel like it's just like any TV show, right? Like and any movie, like there's all these deleted scenes that like when you start to like lay it out, you're like, you know what? I don't know if this is really adding what we thought it would add to the story, and being flexible enough to say that's gotta go. Like, even though we really love this particular moment, is helpful. It sucks, but you got to do it.
Yeah.
So you recorded 2 seasons, and then COVID-19 happened. And I can only imagine that is, both for a podcast with a large cast that records together, and just because people's lives are very different now, I imagine that there are a lot of difficulties there. Is there a question in that statement? Maybe not, but I don't know if there's anything you want to say about how it's affected, your situation or how you're thinking about season 3, etc.
I think that we probably both have something to say about this. I'll keep mine pretty short. I think that, How It Ends we created a studio, we created an LLC, How It Ends Studio, with the goal to eventually release more projects, but we're trying to do things one at a time, right? Because we're only 2 people. So How It Ends as a business suffered this year. We were looking at possibly becoming like solvent and being able to do the things that we have, really the goals that we really set out to compensate the amazing talent that works with us. And beyond Chris, our editor, like we're talking specifically about cast members. And yes, you're right. Our show we do record all together, and we record actually all in the same room. It's not even like in the way the podcasting suite is set up. It's not even individual booths. It's just friends, like having a conversation across a plywood table. And, I think that the social nature of the way we do our show, and the social nature of how we want those relationships and those friendships to translate through the audio, like, and through the story, COVID-19 kicked our ass, I think. And it really does like kind of put a kink in things. And, I think that we'll figure out a creative way to tackle season 3. Like, we're not down and out forever, but we're on pause right now. We're on hiatus trying to figure out how we're going to be able to achieve the same kind of quality and the same kind of authenticity in terms of the character interactions that we were able to do in season 1 or 2. I think a lot of the magic that comes from that, the way that we do it, which is not unique, right? Like, there's lots of people that do things similarly, but there's a lot of magic that comes for our particular cast and like and our show is because we are friends. You know, we're all friends and we all get to spend that time together. And right now, COVID-19 has made it so we can't see our friends. I actually haven't seen Stephanie beyond 30 feet away at her door. We live close together, and I saw her as I was walking around our neighborhood maybe 3 months ago. And we're people that saw each other 2 or 3 times a week, every week for 3 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's made an impact, and it's in that sense, it's painful. I think for me is, to not be able to see people who I love to be around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that pretty much covers what I was going to say. I think, for the business part, but as far as the show goes, it set us back, and we might have to do a little extra work to kind of, bring back our audience, because we were tentatively planning to, release season 3 in the fall, which is kind of like what the schedule we've been on. We've been doing every October or November. But I don't think it's a huge concern. It's just a little extra work that we're going to have to put into whenever we figure this all out.
And we're both willing to do it. It's just critical creative thinking and problem solving.
Yeah.
To try to figure it out. Yeah.
So if someone is out there and thinking about starting their own podcast, maybe a dramatic podcast, a scripted podcast like you've got, do you have any sort of advice to the neophyte podcaster out there?
I would say specifically for audio drama, have your story and have your characters ready. Don't throw them together. We did nothing but write for a full year almost.
Yeah, it was a year.
Yeah. So we didn't even look at microphones or recording or how to edit. That wasn't even on our radar. For a full year, we were what was Micah's favorite color when she was 7? Just really trying to not only develop our characters, but get to know them. And then also, once we were done with that, put them in these situations so that we knew how they would react, because we just knew them so well.
Yeah. And also not to sort of maybe murky up how, I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but how to, not to cloud up how the characters would react based on how I would react, as the person playing Micah. Because there's a lot of things that she does that I frankly would not do. Yeah. I just would not do them. And I think that if I didn't have a really good grasp on how she as a person would respond in a certain way, it would be easy to let myself as a non-trained actor, not an actor, to slide into that and to make that to fall into that trap a little bit, and then to have it bleed together a little bit too much, So I think that's a really great piece of advice that Stephanie gave. I also think that if maybe it's trite or cliche, but if you want to do it, just do it. Just, there was the imposter syndrome blows, and it's real, and it keeps people from being creative. There's this notion that the idea that if I'm not an artist, and I struggle with that as a person who sort of is an artist and has been my whole life. But that feeling is very real, and it keeps you from doing the things that can make you really happy and can also save your life in a lot of ways. And this show in a lot of ways did that for me during, like I said earlier in the interview, a really difficult time. And if I had second guessed myself to the point of saying well, I don't know, maybe it would suck because I don't know what I'm doing, I would have really missed out on probably one of the most valuable, incredible, most fun things that I've ever done in my whole life. And if this is what it is, and we never make any money, it was worth it. Awesome.
Yeah.
It's super worth it. So I think that's really the only, I'm not some sage person podcaster that can tell you how to make a ton of money, but if you want to do something, just do it, and surround yourself with awesome people that are as excited about it as you are. And that's where I think we live.
Yeah.
I think that's the space that we occupy.
And I think also, if you're not interested in the money part of it, don't worry about it. Don't listen to the people who are saying you have to throw an ad in there and you have to monetize it. If you just want to get a microphone and record your friends being silly and then throw it up. It's free. Like, just do it. Like, if that's what you want to do and that's fun with you for you, just that there's no rules, really.
No, there's no rules. And I guess the last thing is the only like sort of technical thing is that make sure the audio quality sounds good.
Yeah.
That's as best as you can, to the best of your ability. You don't have to have the $1,000 microphone to do that.
No,
you really don't.
iPhones are incredible for recording, the newer ones.
Yeah. And you can do things inexpensively, because that's a barrier, right? Like access to equipment and access to even knowledge base to like of how to edit. Like, you know, if you don't know how to do it, like you can take lots of classes for free, and there's YouTube University is like a real thing, right? Mm-hmm. But also, if you do have some money, and you do have a little bit of money and a little bit of leeway there, consider your community and consider paying artists and creators and editors and musicians and that sort of thing that can help you bring your show to life if you don't know how to do or don't have the capacity to do the thing that you want to happen. Mm-hmm. You know, like we thought we were going to do everything when we first started out, and then we're like, this is just not realistic. You know, it's for if we want to bring this to if we want it to be as great and as clear and crystal clear and amazing as we envision it to be. Sometimes that means like letting parts of it go to people that you trust and putting your trust in other people to help you bring that vision to life. And again, have to underscore the cast. Go to our website, howitends podcast.com, and please click on the cast and crew link, because you'll see snippets about everybody who's involved, and everyone is amazing in their own right.
And you can follow them all on Instagram.
You can follow everybody on Instagram. You can get to know them. We have people who are super into hiking, who are performance artists, who are musicians, who are editors, who are other podcasters. Aloysier, Devin, is a podcaster himself. He does Cast of Thousands. And I mean, throw all of your support and your effort into your community, because the people that can make magic happen exist. Mm-hmm. Just have to find them.
Well, that was a good segue into my next question, which is that if people want to hear or check out more the podcast, what should they do, which I feel like you just covered, or if you have other work or projects that you're involved in, how can people find them?
So yeah, you can go to the website, like Micah said, it's howitendspodcast.com. You can find all, like she said, again, the cast and crew, all their Instagrams. But then you can also find, how we talked about earlier, Micah has an Instagram, and Elia as well. We're not in the story right now, because that's part of our character development, like as the voice actor for Elia for me, and as Micah for Micah. We run an Instagram account like based off of their personality, so you can find those there. And there might be little clues hidden in the captions or the photos or the comments. So that's just
going back, maybe a year before this podcast even aired.
Yeah, we started the Instagrams before, like as we were writing and character developing. So that's like a fun extra little thing,
like Easter egg of stuff. Yes. Yeah. I also one thing to do is, if you're on the website and you are like listening and you're into the show, if you sign up for the email list, you automatically get links to curated Spotify podcast
playlist.
Playlist. That's it. Yeah. The playlist that were made, Micah's was made by me, based on who the character is, and Stephanie did Elia's, and Aloysier created Devin. So you're getting even sort of deeper sense as to who those characters are. And we have plans. We have other, kind of irons in the fire of other characters that are working on playlists that we're going to release slowly as the seasons kind of unfold, and as you start to get to know other characters a little bit more, so that you can feel connected to them through music too.
Well, that's really cool. I really enjoyed listening to the podcast. There's kind of an episode 0 that's like a little introduction to it, and maybe I'll throw that up at the end of this video if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I think we could even send you the file too if you need it.
Well, thanks again, and I hope everyone checks out your podcast, and I'm looking forward to the next season.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having us. This was fun.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thank you, Jacob.
I don't think we've ever gotten the opportunity to like kind of talk about our show this way. Yeah. This is rad. Yeah.
Awesome.
My name is Micah Jones. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and I've never made a podcast. I moved here for college and just never left. That was 15 years ago, maybe? Life's been pretty normal until the past year. Now, things seem off. So for as long as I can remember, I've suffered from unnerving recurring dreams and night terrors. And a while back, I started seeing a therapist, Billy, to work some of that out. But, my inability to sleep the night through or to sometimes sleep at all are often topics for discussion. My nightmares have been getting worse. In our last session, Billy suggested writing my dreams down, which they've done countless times before, but I've always avoided it. This time I agreed. But I didn't want to write them down, so I decided to record them. And the first dream I recorded is this recurring dream that I've had since I was a kid. It used to come maybe once or twice a year, but now it's almost weekly. And it's always the same. I'm walking in the woods on a trail that feels familiar, but I don't know where I am. I'm looking around and listening to birds crow overhead. There's water in the distance and everything seems calm. Calm until the moment when an overwhelming feeling of being watched makes it hard to breathe. I almost always wake up screaming, and I can never get back to sleep. My friends Devin and Elliot came in while I was recording that dream, and I had to explain why it seemed like I was just talking to myself, which led to a reluctant and awkward conversation about how distant I've been and what's been going on. But after a while, they convinced me that if I was going to do this, maybe doing something creative with it might make the whole situation better. So here I am. I decided I'm going to document parts of my life as well as some of my therapy sessions with Billy, with some help. Devin's a tech whiz with access to recording equipment, and he said he'd take the lead on putting it together. And Elia made me promise that I'd let her read my tarot cards periodically, to see what the universe has to say about my life. As for me, I just want to figure out why this is happening to me. I'm always so exhausted, and lately, it's sometimes hard to tell what's real and what's not. I don't know where this journey will take me, so follow along, I guess, as I try to uncover the meaning of my dreams and finally get some sleep. This podcast will be an exploration of daily life and then the imprint that it leaves on our memory and consciousness. My memory, my consciousness. That dream I mentioned, the one that I've been having for years, I wake up before it ends, every single time. So welcome to the How It Ends podcast.